something happens there, it's very, very bad. Now, when T cells get activated via different mechanisms, something else is going to happen. They are going to activate the B cells, and the B cells are on the right. And the B cells will then make antibodies. And the antibodies are made not against the fragments, but against the protein that's sitting on this cell here, you see. Now, if these antibodies are present where a virus is, for instance, corona, then these antibodies can bind to that protein and stop that protein from entering a cell. However, and this is something that everyone must learn in school, you know, if you vaccinate someone, or you get vaccinated yourself, and you have antibodies, these antibodies are going to be in the blood. But airway respiratory pathogens don't come into the blood, they come into the lung. And they enter the door that is in front of the hotel. So if antibodies are in the blood, they will never stop the entry of that virus. Never. They cannot, will not, and will never do so. This is not belief, this is fact, and it's been known for decades. Been known for decades in the textbook of medicine. Now imagine that this hall is a blood vessel. The problem is that these so-called vaccines are packaged such that if they're put in the muscle, they will always reach the bloodstream, always. Not all of them, but a sizable portion. And the numbers that are being injected into the muscles of these poor people in the world are so vast that the whole vessel system is going to be filled with these. And the trouble about these vaccines is that they will enter any cell that they contact if they have a chance to, especially where the blood is slowly passing through, which is in the small vessels, the capillaries. That's where it is bound to happen, always. So imagine now that this protein is being made in the vessel wall, because that's what's going to happen. So that protein is going to start projecting out of the roof into the bloodstream. It's going to meet the antibodies that are supposed to stop the virus coming through the front door. It doesn't work. What does work is these antibodies are going to bind. And when these antibodies bind, they will activate the second killer system of the immune system, which is complement. Complement is something that no one has ever heard about, but it is the sister system of the clotting system. The clotting system is activated, the blood clots. The complement system is activated, it kills the cell. So there's a double kill. And the complement-mediated killing is much, much more violent than the T cells. The T cells kill silently, the complement system kills very loudly. And, well, okay, I'm going to tell you something. You know, when I started doing research, no one knew how complement was killing a cell. And I happened to discover how this happened. So that's why I'm standing here, actually. And so this is not science, it's in the textbooks. And I know, therefore, that it is a very, very bad idea to have antibodies binding to the wall of the vessel, because complement is going to join force with the killer lymphocytes and destroy the vessel wall. Now, look, this is a vessel, all right? One is the intact vessel wall. The vaccine comes in the bloodstream, enters the vessel wall cell. In number 3, the wall starts to make the protein. The protein is presented on the surface of the cell, and the fragments are 2, 4, and 5. 4 is the protein, 5 are the fragments. So the antibodies after the first vaccination, everyone gets his antibodies. So when you do the booster, right? It's incredible. How can you do this? Yeah. Then you produce that thing into a bomb, which is the bloodstream, where the antibodies are just waiting with the complement system. They will attack them. Then the T lymphocytes also join in. So the vessel wall is damaged. When the vessel wall is damaged, two things happen. First, the blood will clot, because that's why the blood is, the clotting system is there. And second, those vaccines are going to leak through into the organs. Now, you know, your vessel system is the wonder of nature, of God. It's closed. Even viruses can't get past that. And now these guys, Pfizer, Moderna, are ripping open the vessel system was created by nature, allowing foreign genes to enter the tissues, the brain, the heart, the liver, the lung, anything you want, and they start making the same, they go through the same process. And this, of course, starts off another self-attack, auto-attack, autoimmune process that cannot be stopped, will never be able to be stopped. Never, ever. Look, this is a vessel cast of the brain. Your brain consumes 20% of the oxygen of the body as you are sitting here. Every cell needs its oxygen, and the capillaries of the brain are bringing the blood and the oxygen to those cells. You go clogging up any of those vessels, the cells that are being fed are going to die. And the brain cells will never be replaced. Gone. So depending on where this happens in the brain, anything can happen, anything. In the front lobe, you go around killing islands of death, which are found, by the way, Ryan will tell you, in people with Alzheimer, dementia, it's the front lobe. Lots of little scars in the brain. No one knows why. But if you have a little infarct, you may sort of have a palsy, may not be able to speak, or somewhere else, no one knows, your brain stops functioning, you can't remember, you can't think, you don't have a will, a mind, you become mindless. In some parts of the brain control your movement. You have a palsy if that goes. Another part of the brain controls the relaxations. And if that goes, you start having jerks. Okay? It's so simple. It's going to happen, and it is happening. A part of the brain is responsible for what is most human of all. Your psyche and your personality, your memory, and your ability to think. And that's why it is my conviction, and this is now science, because I don't know this, but I'm observing this around me. People are being changed. They're being changed, and they will never get back to normal, because the cells are dead. What a horrible thought that the WHO, Bill Gates, all these guys, want to vaccinate our children. They are going to destroy humanity. They are going to destroy humanity if you don't do something about this. Now, I'm going to show you pictures of a pathologist who is going to remain unnamed now. If this is true, could it be that people are getting injured, the vessels are getting injured in different parts of the body, like the brain? And this is the first case that is going to be reported, hopefully very soon. This is the brain of a man who died after his third vaccination. No one knew what he died of, but his brain was looked at. And what was found was that the small vessels of the brain carried the spike protein, and there was a vasculitis, and there was a leakage of the vessels. In many parts of the brain, it matched the description of multifocal necrotizing encephalitis, one of the most rare pathological presentations. I think there are only 10 cases known, all in the wake of the flu pandemic. 10 cases. This is a case where there's no flu, there's no virus, because there's no nucleocapsid. This is another section where the pathologist showed that it cannot be the virus. And in the brain, he could see neuronal death, that's number one. These cells are dying. They're dying. And lymphocytes. Why are the lymphocytes there? You know, but others don't yet. And what he found was that these small vessels that were spiked, okay, could be found in other organs too. And this never happens. You get vasculitis not only in the brain, but also in the heart. And he looked at 2 others who died of different things, and Arne Burkhardt is going to be showing more of this. And they all had spike proteins in the vessel wall and vasculitis. This is the heart. And what he saw in the heart was multi-scarring. So islets of death are yellow. Imagine you're a top athlete and you get this. You will never become a top athlete again. You're going to fall down and you will never come back to what you used to be. And this is so important that we get this out to the athletes of the world and the children and all the very bad people who are propagating this. They are evil. They are really evil. They are killing mankind. So beside the islets of death, the scars, he found islets of very fresh lesions, which is here. So the red part is not healthy. There are lymphocytes there. And you see dead and dying myocytes, which are heart cells. Isn't this absolutely horrible? And remember, these vessels are in your brain and in your heart, down to the capillaries. And there are very, very few cases where capillaries get clogged. Very, very seldom. What we're witnessing is that probably millions of people are getting their capillaries clogged. The gift of God, the vessel system. The conclusion is it doesn't matter what this mRNA is encoding for. Every non-self protein is going to create the same disaster. So don't let this happen. Every injected mRNA vaccine will cause severest damage in our body and must be forbidden.
Guten Morgen. Thank you, Dr. Bhakti. That was fantastic. And if I sit down right now and just say a lipid nanoparticle plus an mRNA sequence of any sort is a nuclear bomb, never let it go in the body of anyone ever again, then that would be sufficient. What Dr. Bhakti said is what we know in science, in immunology and pathology, that what we have created is a grand experiment on humanity, and it has gone horribly awry. So no more shots. with a lipid nanoparticle and an mRNA sequence, not just of COVID, but of influenza, of RSV, of any pathogen, because this is what will always happen. So that was obviously brilliant, and that's the main message. Now, what else can this lipid nanoparticle and mRNA do? The views are my own. You can see these slides. These will all be online, so I'm going to go quickly because we have other speakers. The man who does not read has no advantage over the man who cannot read. And that's what we're seeing in society and medicine, is so many clinicians, so many doctors that are bought into safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and they're not reading. They're not reading what we're reading. They don't know what we know. And the problem is the pathologists were the quality control of medicine. We see the problems, we see the changes, we see the patterns. And if you don't know what the pathologists know, you're behind. So we invite our colleagues to listen to the scientists. All right, I'm going to talk about the monster in the room real quick. Cancer. All right, this is what I first started noticing after the shots rolled out. These are endometrial cancers. I saw them in older women, and then younger people were eligible, younger women, and then younger women, and then younger women. There was something new. And it wasn't during the year of COVID. It was when the shots rolled out. All right, these are a few mechanisms that can cause cancer. Gene mutations, a low oxygen environment, chronic viral infections, low interferon response, decreased mitochondrial energy, cell energy, loss of immune surveillance, microRNAs, hormone dysregulation, toll-like receptor alterations. All these things can lead to cancers in the body of many sorts or any sorts. Well, I'll be darned if the spike protein doesn't do all of those things. So colleagues ask, oh, it's impossible for cancers to develop this quickly and behave this aggressively. Oh, really? I'll go through the literature really quickly here. Here's pretty much the list of things that don't cause cancer. Everywhere I go, doctors, clinicians, radiologists, oncologists, I am seeing so much cancer, so much cancer, so much cancer. I'm like, what's new around the world in the arms of billions of people? And I'm not here to judge, and there will be good lectures later talking about things one can do to try to help. If you got one shot, don't get two. If you got two, don't get three. If you got three, don't get four. Resist. You don't need a lipid nanoparticle and an mRNA in your body. Here's the cancer trends from the Centers for Disease Control, the variance in trend. And we're looking at an 8 sigma change. And this is another example of the trends of all cancers. Mutations. We know that portions of this virus can be reverse transcribed into human cells. We know that there's dysregulation of the MSH3 system, which means DNA repair mechanisms are turned off, which leads to your body not being able to correct errors, which turns into mutations. We know in T cells, the spike gets into the nucleus, and now the cells either die or mutate. We know that immune suppression is happening. This is very important. The spike protein binds to very important cancer genes, BRCA and P53. Just a reminder, mammogramming your boobs is more important than Instagramming your boobs. So if you got the shots, make sure you're doing surveillance, because there's a shortage of perfect breasts in the world, and it would be a pity to damage yours. Okay, the P53 is a family of tumor suppressor genes. And this is what happens when P53 loses its function. Oh no. Anyway. The cells start turning over, and cancer genes continue to turn on, and these pathways become terribly aggressive. What about loss of oxygen? Cancer likes to grow in a low oxygen environment. Well, what causes low oxygen? Dr. Bhakti just showed you clots. These are odd clots. These are very protein, amyloid-like clots. Here's what they look like. And again, you can see lots of these online. Fibrin microclots, protein clots, more protein clots. The S1 crosses the blood-brain barrier, that part of the spike. What does it do in the brain? Dr. Bhakti just showed you, it causes clots. This is one from a patient that's lucky enough to still be living that came to my laboratory. These are ones that came from patients that didn't make it. And they're happening in the arteries, not just the slow vessels, not just the venous structures. Immune system alteration. These are suppressing those important T cells. These are causing them to shift those puzzle piece patterns, those squares, those rectangles, those triangles, what they recognize. The body is being altered and certain things are being turned off. Now the body can't fight other infections, and it can fight certain ones well and other ones it can't. It's altering. You have pattern receptors on your cells, toll-like receptors. Number 7 and 8 are responsible for recognizing other viruses. These are turned off. Now all these other people, why are people that are getting 2, 3, 4 shots all of a sudden getting sick all the time with diseases that never caused them a problem? Why are children getting colds and colds and colds? Because this mRNA and lipid nanoparticle is turning off, and the spike protein is turning off the body. Same thing with toll-like receptor 3 and 4. Those are responsible for keeping certain kinds of cancers in check. This is a problem. This study is very important because with a lipid nanoparticle and mRNA in a mouse study, the genes that were turned on and off in that immune system pattern were passed on to the next generation. Every litter of pups, 4 litters in a row that this mom had these gene alterations imprinted after her immune system was altered by these shots. Remember that. Mitochondria, energy of your cell. Dr. Bhakti talked about the brain. The spike protein goes into the brain. The spike protein will bind to the mitochondria. The spike protein, your mitochondria, they give your cells energy. The spike protein binds to them, and now they can't breathe properly. Now your cells don't have the energy they need. The spike protein crosses into all the neural tissues, all of them. And this is just Dr. Bean. I love him to death. He does great lectures. But it blocks the cytochrome C oxidase system one step within that respiration pathway of that mitochondria in the cells. Now your cells are equivalent to a cancer cell in terms of their energy level. They cross the blood-brain barrier, they get into the heart, destroy mitochondria in the heart. And mitochondrial respiration is critically important in the reproductive organs. Hijacks the energy within the eggs, within the ovaries, and in the sperm as well. Interferon fights off cancers. The spike protein suppresses interferon. The spike protein will turn your interferon off. You need it to fight cancers and infections. The spike protein tunes it down. MicroRNAs. How pure are these mRNA shots? The European Medicine Agency looked at these early on when they came out. They were only 50% pure. That means there are lots of fragmented RNAs. It's not a complete sequence to make a spike. There's a lot of incomplete ones. Australia, same thing, the TGA there, impure vials, impure vials. What does that mean? All these little fragments, some are coding and some don't code for proteins, but they're not making the protein they're supposed to. And there are countless papers that microRNAs can cause cancer. Many, many papers. MicroRNAs and cancer, potentials and challenges. And there's a little scale, and some of these, if they mutate one way or another, they tip the balance, and then they become cancer-causing irregular proteins that the body doesn't need. What about hormones? Anybody heard of women bleeding after these shots? You bet. How many cancers in the body are driven by hormones? Almost all of them in one way or another. And when you have hormones out of balance, now these aggressive cancers can take off like wildfire. Again, just papers, 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 so you don't have to believe me. Go to the literature, it's there. The man who does not read has no advantage over the man who cannot read. And I invite my colleagues around the world to read. Conclusions, there are many cancer mechanisms. Thank you. There are many cancer mechanisms induced by the spike protein. Countless studies still need to be done. All national health databases around the world should be opened up to the tax-paying public, and all cancers need to be assessed by age groups. And we need to look at 2015 to 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. The changes are already there. The data is there. It's not being shared with the world. The pathologists are seeing it, the doctors are seeing it, the clinicians are seeing it. Delaying this very critical study will lead to many more deaths that don't need to happen. The spike protein is a known harmful protein. If it is not safe, it does not matter if it's effective, which it's not effective, but that's what's most important. This is the tip of the iceberg. We all could give you a 3-hour lecture. Be grateful that we're not. Happy note, don't forget at the end of the day, we're all still here. We've lost loved ones, we've seen people harmed, but don't forget to live life. Be joyful. Liebe. We need to help each other, love each other, fight corruption. We need to forgive each other. We need to forgive some of those who have done things and hold others responsible, certainly. But we need to be bold and relentless for the truth. We need to laugh, and we need to love again and live life. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was really fantastic, both of you. Now the question is, what does a clinician do on a pathologist panel? That's a good question, isn't it? Some of you probably heard my presentation yesterday, and I talked yesterday about why we need to look at the clinics, because the pathology alone doesn't help us, because the protagonists of the vaccinations, they tell us, well, these are just a few cases that you're presenting. Let's take a look at the big picture, and we are saving hundreds of thousands of lives. So we need to question that. And I need this little thing here. I go over this. Look at this. This was a double-page ad in the physicians' paper, Austrian magazine for physicians, and all these famous Austrian people, they propagated the vaccine. Everybody needs to get vaccinated because the vaccine is very safe and very effective, and it will help us stop the pandemic, it will save many, many lives, and so forth. And in the newspapers, we see headlines like this: 70% of the patients on intensive care are unvaccinated. And we have propaganda to vaccinate our children. The flyer to the left was distributed in Austrian schools last year, and the flyer to the right just came out, proposed by the city of Munich, and propagates the children's vaccination for the beginning of the school year. Unbelievable. The question is, does COVID vaccination prevent infection, hospitalization, and death? And I will go very quickly through this because I have gone through this yesterday. And if we look at the epidemiological curve, this is the epidemics of Austria. You see the first wave, you can almost not recognize it anymore because it was so small. And I wonder why we needed a lockdown to prevent these large number of infections if we compare it to the Delta and the Omicron waves that we had this past year. And you see at the first wave, nobody was vaccinated, and it went away by itself. And when we started vaccination campaigns, we actually got the big waves of the epidemic after that. I will go quickly through this. The same picture for hospitalized patients, for ICU patients, and for deaths. There's no correlation between the vaccination of the population and the epidemiological curve in Austria. And this international study showed no correlation between the proportion of the population being vaccinated and the number of new COVID cases. In fact, if you look at the line, it goes from, you can't see it very well. There's a line that goes from the bottom left and it rises towards the right, which actually shows the opposite. The more vaccinations, the more new COVID cases we got in the countries. And this is another study that shows very clearly that the vaccination is not effective even in passing the infection on to somebody else. So it is not a good argument for the vaccine, because that argument was presented many times. We have to vaccinate the children to prevent the infection of old people and vulnerable groups. It doesn't work. We have very clear studies for that. So I wonder, how come our politicians and our leading experts can all say, well, these vaccines, they are so good, they're so effective, and they're so safe? Let's take a look at the studies, and I want to show you why these studies are false. And I will give you two examples. The one is the approval study for the Pfizer vaccine, and the second is one large post-marketing study from Israel. The approval study, safety and efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine. This is the main result, and it shows a vaccine efficacy of 95%. That looks pretty good, doesn't it? And that is what has been told to us. And if we take a very close look, we can see that these 95% are actually a very, very small proportion of saved infections, because only infections were measured, because there weren't enough hospitalizations and deaths to even make a statement about this. And of the 18,000 subjects who were injected the vaccine and the 18,000 that got the placebo, only 8, or respectively 162, a very small proportion, had a PCR test positive symptomatic COVID infection. What's the problem with this? Well, the first problem of this study is that the primary outcome does not have any clinical relevance, because I don't really care if I have a PCR test positive COVID infection. It's a cold, nothing more. It's nothing. 30% of the people infected with COVID don't have any symptoms at all. So the real important clinical outcome would be, and that should have been investigated in the approval studies, does it prevent hospitalizations and deaths? But in the approval studies, there weren't even any hospitalizations and deaths to make any statement about that, because the observation time was only in the average 6.6 weeks. Well, do you need a vaccination to be protected for 6.6 weeks? No, that doesn't make sense, right? If we got vaccinated, we want at least to have a protection for 1 year, as we have for the flu. So any study investigating only 6 weeks is bullshit. The second mistake they made, on purpose of course, they excluded the time between the first vaccination and 7 days after the second vaccination. Now, I wonder who of any vaccinated people can jump from the first vaccination directly to 1 week after the second vaccination, passing through this time and not counting any event that happened during that time. That doesn't make sense. It is methodologically wrong to do it that way. And the third mistake they made. They only counted PCR test positive symptomatic infections, because we know that the PCR test does not have a sensitivity of 100%. And the second problem they had with this, not everybody in this study got a PCR test. So we have more data from this study, and these data were only given to the FDA. They were not presented in the publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. And in this publication of the FDA data, there were 1,594 clinical suspected cases of COVID-19, and in the placebo group there were 1,816. That comes to a relative risk of 88% and a vaccine effectiveness of 12%. Do you think it makes sense to get vaccinated with a possibly dangerous vaccine with an effectivity of 12%? Now, then, also from the FDA data, they took a look what happened during the first 7 days after vaccination that were excluded from the publication in the New England Journal. And there were 409 cases in the vaccinated group and only 287 in the placebo group. So the risk is 44% increased during the first 7 days to get a COVID infection. Now, this is really interesting, although you won't be able to read it, but I show you these tables because they're original tables out of the FDA document and out of the New England Journal of Medicine publication. In both, we have not the same number, not exactly the same number, but at least a similar number of 21,000 people in each group, in the placebo group and in the vaccinated group. So then we go through all the numbers, and we end up in the FDA with 20,566 in the vaccine group and 20,536 in the placebo group. But in the New England Journal, we only have 18,000 in each group. So what happened to these 3,000 patients from the 21,000 that we started with? They don't tell us. They keep these data secret. Then we go on. Severe COVID between the first and the second dose, which was excluded from the New England Journal publication. We had 39 in the Pfizer group and 82 in the placebo group, only a vaccine effectiveness of 50%. There were no deaths at all, and after 6 months we had a re-evaluation of that study, and we had 15 deaths in the vaccinated group and only 14 in the placebo group. So the risk was even higher to die in the vaccinated group. Okay. So the raw data are kept secret by Pfizer, and they were originally supposed to be published in 70 years. That's nice, isn't it? In 70 years? Probably most of us won't be living anymore. The data were manipulated in at least one study center. In the 6 months evaluation, there was no advantage of the vaccine. And since that, the placebo group was discontinued because you can't withhold such a good vaccine from the placebo patients. So they were vaccinated as well, and we don't have a control group anymore. So no further evaluations were published. Yes, I'm over time. A little bit over time, and we'll have some questions for you too after, Professor. I think I'm going to skip the second study because it has a very similar picture. And I just want to read this statement from the New England Journal to you to end this with. Pfizer was responsible for the design and conduct of the trial, data collection, data analysis, data interpretation, and the writing of the manuscript. Now we know why the publication is the way it is. And that's the same with all the studies that show any effectiveness of this vaccination, which does not exist in reality. Thank you very much.
Professor Burkhardt, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you very much. Now, I have decided not to show you any pictures and not overload you with histological details. They are very well documented in the internet in the 3 pathology conferences that we gave. And also, the speakers before me, Sucharit and Brian, also showed you the essential pathology findings. What I will present here, what I will talk about here, is how I and we as a group got involved into this project. Now we call it the Reutlingen project because this is where I work and where our laboratory is. And just about more than a year ago, actually, I wanted to go into retirement and to close the laboratory. And then something happened that was not very unusual first, that some relatives approached me and said, well, my father or my mother died and I do not believe it's a natural cause. It might be related to the vaccination. Now this happens to a pathologist about once a year, but then all of a sudden 5, 6, 10 relatives approached me with this. And well, at that time I was very innocent and I just said, well, of course I will look at it. And I was thinking, well, I look at it and I can give them consolation and say, well, this is all natural. It is a hard and fact. But already after the 5 first cases, I saw there was something absolutely different from what I saw before. And then I got support from some other pathologists. Some of them don't want to be mentioned. And also we had some special questions and approached chemists, physicists, and so on. So this really evolved from a harmless second opinion to a scientific project. And actually we have new findings almost every week and every time we meet and look at this. And it's all looked at it by us, by 2 pathologists, and we have by internet, we have consultations with other international pathologists. Now, important in our series of autopsies, and we have 60 autopsies now and about 15 biopsies that we have examined. It is important that most of these persons who were autopsies died suddenly at home and without any therapy. So we don't have the overlap with therapeutic effects in these cases. So it's what we find really can be tracked to the vaccination. And we found a pattern of lesions, which I will talk about after that, which is very characteristic after vaccination, and it's very difficult to judge whether this was a cause of death or whether it had contributed to the death, but we came to the conclusion that about 80% of the persons who die in connection with the vaccination. The vaccination has some more or less specific and important role in the death process. So this is 80%, and there's only one other published series, and they come to the conclusion that it's 30%. So this might be a different collective that they looked at. Now, Sucher had already showed some very important pictures, and I will not go into details of specific organ-specific lesions, but focus on the generalized lesions that we found. And first of all, and this is, I think, very important, in all cases, the spike protein could be shown practically in all organs in different measure, and of course, always very specifically in lesions that we saw, and these lesions are especially in the endothelium, as was shown before, and we find some desquamation of the endothelium, which is a lining of the small vessels, and then thrombocytes touching there, and also some strange proteinaceous material, which I will go into later. So this is the small vessels. They are affected practically in all cases, more or less, not always very extremely, but they are mostly found in the myocardium and in the brain, and the brain is actually the most alarming finding that we have, because practically all of our autopsies patients had lesions in the small vessels of the brain. Then we had some findings that we first said as unidentified. So we had unidentified what we thought foreign particles. And we did some analysis of this also with physical and chemical methods, and we are right now into evaluating this, but it seems to be that most of these particles that are found in vacuoles in many organs, especially in the spleen, might be cholesterol. And we have the question, where does this cholesterol come from? It's definitely not from the injection, vaccination injection, because it's much too much. The vaccination injection is only very, very little. So our theory right now is that due to the lesion and destruction of the endothelium, the atheromatous plaques in the large vessels get dissolved and flow into the blood and may be caught and deposited in some organs. Now this is just an evolving theory, and we will do further examination on that. Now the second is we found first what we called first unidentified proteinaceous deposits, especially in the vessel walls, in the intima, and also around. And we have strong evidence now that this is an amyloid-like material, which is probably not known to most of you, but it's a disease called amyloidosis, where this misfolded amyloids are deposited, and it might evolve from the spike protein, or at least be instigated by the spike protein. So this is another point that we are evaluating right now. Then we have actually some foreign bodies that we found, but this is actually apparently not the big problem. We only found it definitely in 2 cases. But right now we are investigating the so-called clot formation. Ryan already referred to this. You may be aware that in deceased persons at autopsies or embalming, there are these clots found in the vessels. It's definitely so extensive that it could not be compatible with the idea that this was formed during life. But probably it has grown after life with the cooling of the body. And the interesting thing, and this is just last week, that we received a clot from a living person. This person, or the doctor had the observation that when he took the blood sample and put it in the refrigerator of this vaccinated woman who had severe problems with perfusion, blood perfusion, that it formed clots. And these clots were white and rather firm. And we did a histological examination, and actually it's definitely not a thrombosis. It is definitely some fibrous material that is formed. It's practically acellular, so there are no fibrocytes or anything in there. And there are only few dispersed lymphocytes in there, and not erythrocytes. So it's very strange how this could form after cooling and not include erythrocytes. So the point that is very alarming is the fact this woman reports that she feels fine when the outside temperature is above 25 degrees. And if it's lower, she gets what we call Raynaud syndrome, so some strange perfusion, well, the internet could explain it. It's a problem of blood perfusion. So I think we will go further into this, and we will take samples from more patients, also those without and those with problems after vaccination. And this might be a very alarming thing, because if we have a cold winter and there are more people like that, they will have problems. So this is actually just an update of what I have presented before in different locations and in different presentations. And you can all look this up in the internet. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burkhardt. It's been fascinating hearing from the pathologists what we were seeing as scientists and analyzing the pharmacovigilance databases a year ago, seeing what the pathologists are finding, basically reinforcing and showing us the pathology behind what we were seeing. And I remember looking at the yellow card scheme, which is the UK's pharmacovigilance database where drug adverse reactions are registered. And in May last year, the preponderance of deaths, and there were over 800 there were 1,200 and something deaths associated with the vaccines then, and over 800 of those were due to bleeding and clotting disorders. And what struck me then, looking at those data, were the variety of large vessel clots. So there were clots in the aorta, clots in the renal arteries, in the heart, in the brain, and to the ovaries. There were just clots, occurring in vessels you wouldn't expect. So even then in May, it was just astounding the way that these clots were just being formed in very large vessels. So thank you so much for all the work you've been doing. It's just so helpful in elucidating what's been going on. I'm interested to know, there's been some, well, especially with regard to the clot that you mentioned, and also what the embalmers have been removing. The clots seem to be unusual clots, and there was a recent study showing the mineral composition of those clots differs. Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I read this article, and definitely it proves that this is not a banal thrombus. It's something different. That's why I call it a clot, and they call it a clot.
Yes. Ryan, have you done any studies on that?
I have, and we have more coming as well. And no, they contain normal clot elements. There's fibrin, white cells, red cells, but in parts of them there are thick proteins, and those areas are pale. And because of that, the mineral concentrations are different than just kind of a regular, red jelly-like clot that we would see. These are thick, rubbery, fibrous. They're different composition. We know from Dr. Pretorius in South Africa, the spike protein is causing the proteins to clump without platelets present. On the surface of the cells in them, there's extra molecules on the surface like Dr. Bhakti was showing. These are called intercellular adhesion molecules. They make the cells more sticky, and they stick to each other more readily as well. And we know the spike protein binds to many different receptors, and those receptors are activated and cause the cells to just, in a domino-like effect, fold, stick, fold, stick, fold, stick. And so we're seeing clots from this spike protein that we usually don't see from other viruses. So yes, they're unusual. Yes, we're studying them, and we invite our colleagues around the world. You're in universities, you have access to the equipment, you have access to the proteins. It behooves you, wherever you are in the world, whether you like your finding or not, the truth is what you should seek always on behalf of humanity. And the ability is present for people to study these things, and they need to be doing it.
Thanks. Thank you. And certainly, the science can be hard to stomach at the moment, but one of the most wonderful things that seems to be coming out of this COVID experience is the amazing collaboration between doctors and scientists around the world. So I'd be fascinated and interested to know what's happening in the pathology world, and how are you pathologists and doctors working together around the world to bring, especially independent scientists, to bring this information forward?
Well, and it is the independent scientists that are making the findings, because they're the ones without fear. And they don't have the fear of coercion or reprisal or an oppressive dean or an oppressive academic system saying what you are or aren't allowed to do like a little puppy dog. We're critical thinkers working together. So we've collaborated across the internet, and I learned from Dr. Burkhardt and his group, and we learned from other doctors like Dr. Craig in the UK, and thankfully with the internet, we're able to connect to each other and learn from each other and design new studies. Now, we're doing this out of our own pockets at our own expense. The governments of the world should be funding these things with this new technology. Dr. Bhakti was just telling me, we've created a whole new realm of study, and that's lipid nanoparticle mRNA disease that we will be learning from for decades to come now, unfortunately. I mean, this is a whole realm of science now, these mechanisms. So we're collaborating on a small level, but there should be thousands of pathologists. They're seeing what we're seeing, and many of them know what's happening, but they won't say it for fear of loss of job. And again, I will say, don't live a life of fear, live a life of truth.
Much of what we've heard is quite frightening, particularly for people who have taken the injections, and I think we probably agree that the more you take, there's a cumulative effect. So, generally we would all urge people who've had one not to take another, who've had two just not to take another, have three just don't take any more. But is there some reason from your experiences and studies to suggest that there is a way that one can clear the pathology?
This is We don't know is the honest answer. And sometimes in science, that's the best answer. We don't know, and we're trying to find out. But there's not one good study yet that shows when the body does. I mean, we have clinical colleagues who are doing vaccine injury clinics or long-haul post-COVID clinics that are having a lot of success with certain medicines. So from a clinical point of view, they're seeing success. From a pathology point of view, the studies by Dr. Roltgen in the journal Cell out of Stanford show that the sequence, because it has a synthetic uridine in it, is persisting at least 60 days. Other studies, Journal of Immunology, show 4 months. Other studies show 15 months. We don't know when the body, not everybody's body keeps doing this. So it's not everybody, that's the good news. But we don't know when the process turns off. There's not one single study showing, okay, here's the cutoff date when the body stops making spike protein and that sequence that was there is degraded and goes away. We don't know yet. And so again, these are studies that need to be funded.
Do you have an explanation why some people seem to take that vaccine very well? I mean, we have, in Germany, we had now 180 million vaccinations, about 65 million people vaccinated 1, 2, or 3 times. And of course, we know there are many that are badly affected by the vaccine and they have a lot of problems, but apparently there are quite a few people that don't seem to have any problems from the vaccination, which doesn't justify a vaccination that is not effective. but still, I mean, do you have an explanation for that?
Good manufacturing processes don't exist for this. These are emergency authorized products made in multiple factories around the world at different concentrations. Dr. Burkhardt and I are in contact with a colleague that has looked at many of these vials. No graphene oxide, just to put that out of your mind. Cholesterol, sugars, salts, and polyethylene glycol in high ratios in some and low in others. So they're not the same. Each vial from different lots is not the same concentration. The other thing where a lot of people dodged a bullet and a potential harm is when people lined up in stadiums or outside and had these vaccination clinics, these vials weren't kept cold, and those fats turned into a glob of mush and the RNA broke down into nothing. So you got a shot of mush, which you're lucky, very lucky, because it wasn't kept cold. And so the other thing too is when you stir lipid nanoparticles, polyethylene glycol, and mRNA sequences, you can't agitate it quickly. You have to just put it in like a gently, slow, smooth jazz dance. Well, when that happens, the lipids kind of float to the top. Now you have thousands of vials going across an assembly line, spitting out the content. And the first couple thousand vials get a very dilute solution. You're not getting a lot of dose of mRNA or lipid. And that would explain our colleagues' findings. But then at the end of that batch, now you have some very concentrated lipid and mRNA. So in each manufacturing run of this very poor manufacturing process, which has lots of debris and lots of vials and all these heebie-jeebies and creepy things, are mostly manufacturing debris. And that's, again, what some of the mass spec we've looked at has shown. It's from stainless steel vats, it's from aluminum seals, it's from gaskets, et cetera, it's from crushed glass. All that crazy stuff that's out there. As a pathologist, having looked at a lot of these, and there's a big show coming out that you'll see soon, as Dr. Burkhardt's colleague has looked at some of these, the more we look at, it's bad manufacturing. And a lot of people, thank heavens, absolutely, that there's the bad manufacturing. And that answers why a lot of people have been fine. Because if these were, a good manufacturing process in a drug development process takes years, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years until you have a product pure enough that you can repeat every single time that it comes off the line that it's the same thing. You saw in that early European Medicine Agency last year, 50% pure. It's supposed to be a 99+% pure product. That tells you everything you need to know right there. But a lot of people are lucky because of that.
So I'd just like to go back to last year and that report that we wrote in June to the UK's authorities. Whilst the leading cause of death in association with the vaccines was from a clotting or bleeding hemorrhagic condition, the most frequently reported conditions were neurological. So I have, I suppose, two questions. The one is, if it's the neurological conditions, one would probably expect to, if they didn't resolve, to degenerate over time and perhaps be reflected later on in a longer temporal association to the vaccine, so it might not be necessarily attributed to the vaccines. And what would those sort of end-stage diseases look like? And then, in fact, maybe you just want to deal with that first. And then...
That's a great question. So, because historically, vaccines were a killed protein or a killed organism with an adjuvant. And so most adverse reactions you think of happening within the first week or two. But because of the mechanism of this spike being produced by the body at a continuous low rate, but continuously produced and crossing across those blood-brain barriers, and that lipid nanoparticle, the brain is very fatty. Lipid nanoparticles were originally designed to carry chemotherapy to the brain. So we know that this fatty lipid likes to go to fatty tissues, and our brain cells, if someone calls you a fathead, take it as a compliment, because your brain is, your membranes are mostly fat. And so this fat goes into fat, and then these degenerative processes, yes, microclotting for sure, but these degenerative processes in the neural tissues, a lot of that has to do with the mitochondria being destroyed, and now your neurons don't have the energy to produce the electrical signal they need over time. So these are slow processes. We're seeing them faster than, you know, we want to see. A lot of COVID disease is accelerating physiologic processes, which is very unfortunate, but these neurologic conditions are very explainable by how that spike gets past the blood-brain barrier, and the images that Dr. Burkhardt showed yesterday in those small vessels and then Dr. Bhakti showed today.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to add one thing, and that is that the crossing into the tissues can well be independent of the spike. I cannot repeat often enough that the damage to the vessel wall will lead to leakage of these nanoparticles. And what I wanted to say is that the lipids themselves in these nanoparticles, they go to the mitochondria, and they also they wreak havoc in the cells. And this is all independent of the spike. So I think it's very important to look at the spike, but to keep in mind, first, this is going to happen to every mRNA vaccine, and second, the booster effect. Because every booster makes the attack system more and more aggressive. And this is the path, actually, to immune-dependent enhancement of infection and to increased intensiveness of the adverse effects. So it's not cumulative. It's a real new shot of bomb going off, and the bombs get bigger and bigger and bigger. Don't get a booster.
Thanks, Dr. Bhakti. And just on... just to take that, what you said earlier about the tremors and things that you were seeing, and people, you know, being associated with cell death in the brain. Is it possible that some of that is due to, is it all a central thing, or is it due to peripheral nerves being damaged as well?
I don't know, but you know, when I saw these pictures of people with the jerks, I started reading up on my textbooks of neurology, which I still possess. And then it's Huntington disease. You know what Huntington is? These people have a gene defect in the Huntington protein, and that is a position of the putamen, I think it's called. It's a very tiny area in the brain. And these people, the neurons die prematurely. So they're 40 to 50 years old. And the putamen is important to keep the motor what's it called? The cerebellum under control. And if that goes, then people start getting the jerks. And it's it's classic Huntington, which normally doesn't happen to people without this gene defect. Now, if you go around killing those cells because there's a clot or clog, you get Huntington. It's so simple.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, we have to end the session. There's about a million more questions we could ask, but you know, we've heard science today, and this is real science. It's the truth. But I want to remind everybody there's more to life than science, and you know, we've heard also that, you know, it might be rather distressing to hear this science and these facts being laid out so bare. And we heard from Dr. Bhakti that brain tissue, you know, brain cells when they are killed, they never come back. Which is very distressing, and I certainly, you know, grew up with the idea that never say never. However, I'm going to say never too now, and I'm going to say it's never too late to take control of your health. And so while you're listening to all of this, you know, please bear in mind that this is a great opportunity for everybody, whether you've had an injection or not, to just say, actually, I'm going to take control of my health now. Life is a journey, and we're all learning. And so, you know, regardless of what your perspective is on the COVID vaccines, you know, it's a great opportunity for you to take control of your health and not outsource it to anyone else. So I'd just like to thank our speakers and prepare for the next panel.
So this is your applause. Thank you so much, Professor Bhakti,